Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant to bring you part 3 of my Halo vs. Mass Effect matchup. This section will cover the weaponry used by each faction. Starting with Halo, because it's the most straightforward, we've got two major factions combining resources since I'm teaming up the UNSC with the Covenant, and they both come with their own kinds of weapons. I'll start with the ground-based weaponry because it's the most commonly seen in both games and are the easiest to quantify. The UNSC, being a human faction from not-so-distant future Earth, uses largely conventional firearms of various calibers and refire speeds. They're cool, but I'm not going to go into too much depth on them because everybody knows generally how guns work and what they're capable of doing. They can do plenty of damage to unshielded and unarmored targets, but what's important is that they're also capable of overwhelming shields, but only after repeated hits or a single really heavy hit. That is, if you unload your entire magazine of relatively low caliber rounds into a shielded target, you'll probably get through eventually and hit the guy whose shields are protecting. But if you're using a heavier caliber weapon, like a sniper rifle, a headshot will probably take out your target because shields are relatively weak there and sniper rounds hit really hard. It's also important to note that all UNSC armor prior to encountering the Covenant was specifically designed to resist small arms fire, but with enough firepower that too could be overwhelmed. As for plasma weaponry, which the Covenant largely uses, this caused a lot of problems for humanity throughout their war with the Covenant, and especially at the beginning of the fighting when even the Spartans were unshielded. Plasma weapons, despite what you may have seen in the games where shooting unarmored grunts repeatedly would have them just waddle off just fine, are terrifyingly dangerous. In one early encounter with the Covenant, in the books, a team of Spartans lost a squad mate because they were hit once by a single plasma shot which melted straight through their Mjolnir armor. The plasma shots are also slightly homing, making them highly effective and dangerous in even the clumsiest of hands. Plasma weaponry is effective against Covenant and UNSC shields, melts armor, and is absolutely deadly to anything without sufficient protection. The Covenant also includes some other weaponry, including needlers, which fire these Subanese crystals at their targets, which proceed to track them. They're homing as well. Attempt to hit them, and once they do, they dig in and then detonate a few seconds later. Finally, the Covenant make use of common use, that is, of fuel rod cannons, which are basically the Covenant equivalent of grenade launchers. With almost all plasma weaponry, with the exception of beam weapons, the plasma is relatively slow-moving, like you can track its progress across a room, not even approaching the supersonic speeds of firearm projectiles, making their inherent tracking ability a huge component of actually being able to hit anything. As for space weaponry, the UNSC space weapons of choice are a mix of missiles, nukes, and of course, mass drivers, which are basically really beefy railguns. The downside of the missiles and nukes is that they're really easily detected and intercepted by enemies, though if they do manage to make contact, they do pretty good damage. Mass drivers don't have that problem. They fire heavy projectiles at hypervelocity speeds, inflicting major damage on anything they hit. The trick is actually hitting them, since the big guns are dumbfire and they are limited by a relatively slow refire rate. They're also so massive that most UNSC ships only have a single mass driver cannon, though some will have more. The larger ones, or at least specially made ones, Commander Keyes in particular, managed to make very good use of a ship that utilized a pair of smaller mass drivers. Unfortunately for the UNSC, mass driver rounds from ships are typically not heavy enough to take down shielded ships, that is, taking out the shields and the ship behind them in the same hit. This meant that engagements with the Covenant would typically require multiple UNSC ships targeting the same Covenant ship. The first would take out the shields, the second would hopefully destroy the ship. This led to a lot of UNSC losses throughout the war since their technological disadvantage was pretty staggering, particularly at the beginning of the conflict. Covenant space weaponry was largely dominated by plasma cannons. Just like their ground equivalent, these were thermal weapons which could cause extreme damage to unarmored, armored, or shielded targets alike. The plasma wouldn't move all that quickly, more like a missile rather than a mass driver, but short of body blocking the shots, there was no way to intercept them, and even a single hit would burn so hot that UNSC ships hit by any amount of plasma would see their hulls start to melt in an expanding wound that would eventually destroy the ship. The plasma was also homing, just like the ground-based weaponry, meaning that it was possible to dodge incoming fire, but really, really difficult. Moving on to Mass Effect, and again starting with ground-based weaponry, with very few exceptions, all Mass Effect weaponry is basically miniaturized railguns. Each will shave tiny bits of metal off an internal block and then use mass-reducing fields using element 0 and mass accelerators to launch those shavings at insane speeds at their enemies. The mass reduction inside the gun helped you to not destroy yourself with the recoil. The major limitation on these weapons, and their being able to be fired more than once, was heat buildup. Some weapons, particularly in the first game, would have self-cooling systems built in, so you don't really ever run out of ammo for a very long time, but you do periodically have to vent the heat, or the weapon will just slag itself. Later games introduced thermal clips, which would allow much more rapid cooling because you'd basically have a heat sink that once it reached capacity, you would just throw the heat sink away and slap in another one. But this ultimately ended up working out like swapping magazines on a standard firearm, and this way you would actually sort of run out of ammo. These weapons could also utilize specialized ammo varieties to make them more effective against specific threats, including hardened, armor-piercing, cryo, which would freeze armor, to make it more brittle and thus more vulnerable, disruptor, which would do increased damage to shielded targets, incendiary, which could burn hot enough to melt armor and set targets ablaze, shredder, which is less effective against armor and shields but did extreme damage to unprotected targets, and warp ammo, which helped circumvent the protection afforded by biotics. Speaking of biotics, Mass Effect has what amounts to basically magic. Basically, either through rare inborn ability or through augmentation with a bioamp, some people can use Element Zero to create Mass Effect fields which allow them to shield themselves, push, pull, or tear apart enemies. The level of power involved varies wildly depending on the user, how naturally powerful they are, how much practice they put in, and what they've been doing to further augment their abilities, which can range from just being able to push a single person around to being able to launch whole groups into the air while deforming walls and otherwise causing extreme damage to everybody. As far as I'm aware, naturally occurring biotics can occur in any of the Mass Effect races, in particular those who have been exposed to Element Zero, but are generally fairly rare. The exception is the Asari, who are all biotic from birth, though developing any real skill with the ability requires practice. As for space weaponry, this is where a lot of speculation starts happening, largely because the only ship we get to really know much about is the Normandy, and for the life of me, I cannot find much in the way of stats on any other ships. The Normandy itself is not really a warship, like it's capable of doing combat, but it's more meant to be a stealth infiltration ship, or like inserting a commando team type of ship, so it can hold its own, but it is not a full-on warship. And it's also a ship that is representative of the least advanced faction of the Citadel, humans. The weapon of choice for humanity following the Battle of the Citadel at the end of Mass Effect 1 was a reverse-engineered and scaled-down version of the standard Reaper weapon, the Phoenix Cannon. This weapon could only fire reliably every 5 seconds, but each shot consisted of a core of molten iron, uranium, and tungsten suspended in an electromagnetic field powered by Element Zero, and then accelerated to relativistic speed, solidifying into a projectile while being fired, and striking with enough force to pierce any known armor or shield or anything, including that of a Reaper, which, if you're not aware, Reapers are really durable. Unfortunately, I'm not finding anything about what the rest of the fleet uses for weaponry, but considering the fact that the Phoenix Cannon was developed in cooperation with the Turians, and everyone was actually playing nice with each other at the time when it was developed, so they could eventually, fight the Reapers, I think it's pretty safe to assume that all Citadel ships come equipped with Phoenix cannons. In addition, I think it's also safe to assume, considering the scale of the weapons is small enough to be mounted on fighters while still being highly effective, that larger ships would carry multiple Phoenix cannons in their arsenals. For example, the Galea-type dreadnoughts that the Asari fielded were used to directly face off against Reapers, resulting in several being destroyed, but implying, at least to me, that they were confident that their weaponry could actually do damage to the Reapers, which, as demonstrated in the battle for the Citadel against Sovereign, wasn't necessarily a given for any Citadel ships at that time. Fortunately, for the whole galaxy, everyone got some pretty significant upgrades after that particular battle. I'll be covering defenses next, and at that point, I think we'll better be able to determine how effective this weaponry will actually be in the matchup. There's a few types of weaponry that, just looking at what the weaponry actually does, I don't think will work at all against certain types of defenses, but we'll leave that until next section. But what do you all think in the meantime? Have I left out some major category of destruction that really needs to be addressed? Does the inclusion of biotics make this whole matchup somewhat silly? Well, maybe, but they're cool, so I'm not ignoring them. But until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.